Your mother just died. Good. Now you have somewhere to go. Because you will not be buried beside this family. I made sure of that this morning. Dolores Marsh said it without raising her voice. That was the worst part. She didn't need to. The call lasted 4 minutes. I know because my phone logs it that way. 4 minutes and 9 seconds. I've looked at it more times than I should admit. That little number sitting there on my screen like it means something. Like 4 minutes is enough time to undo 32 years. I was standing at Roanoke Memorial Gardens when she called. Section C, row 14. The grave was still open. They hadn't finished. There was a folding chair someone had set up for me near the edge, but I hadn't used it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought sitting down would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. My mother's name was Ruth Ellen Carpenter. She was 79 years old. She had a garden she loved and a Bible she read every morning and a way of saying my name, Eleanor, that made it sound like something worth being. She died on a Tuesday. I was on a military transport out of Fort Bragg when it happened. I landed at 6:14 a.m. She passed at 6:02. 12 minutes. That's the other number I can't stop looking at. I wish I could tell you I handled the call with the kind of discipline 30 years in the Army teaches you. That I stood straight and kept my breathing even and said something measured and correct. But the truth is I didn't say anything at all. I just held the phone against my ear while Dolores talked, and I looked down at the flowers I'd brought. White carnations, my mother's favorite, still wrapped in the plastic from the gas station on Route 220, because I hadn't had time to find a proper florist. And I thought, Ruth Ellen Carpenter drove 4 hours every time I was stationed somewhere new. She learned the names of every soldier in my unit. She sent Christmas cards to people she'd never met because she said anyone who looked after her daughter was family. And the woman on the phone was telling me I had nowhere to go when I died. A few hours earlier, before the service, before the folding chairs and the pastor from my mother's church who'd known her 40 years and cried more than I did, I had driven past the house I grew up in on Elm Street in Roanoke. I don't know why. I wasn't going anywhere near it. I just turned down that street without thinking, the way you do when your body remembers a route your mind has tried to forget. The oak tree in the front yard was still there. Bigger now. My mother used to sit under it in the evenings with a glass of sweet tea and wait for me to come home from school. I was thinking about that tree when my phone rang the second time that morning. I looked at the name on the screen. Dolores Marsh. I knew what it was before I answered. Some part of me had always known this call was coming. Not today, not at this exact moment standing at my mother's grave with dirt on my shoes and carnations in my hand, but someday. Dolores had been building towards something for 32 years. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to finish it. I answered anyway. Because that's what you do. You answer. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing there in Section C, row 14, listening to a woman tell me I had no place among the living or the dead, was that 7 days later, the United States government would send 2 men in dress uniform to Roanoke Memorial Gardens with a piece of granite that said otherwise. But that comes later. First, you need to understand who Ruth Ellen Carpenter was, and who her daughter became, and why a woman named Dolores Marsh spent 32 years trying to make sure nobody ever found out. Eleanor Marsh turned 61 in March, alone in a studio apartment in Roanoke, Virginia, with a cup of coffee she'd made too strong and a card from her son that arrived 2 days late. She didn't mind the lateness. Daniel was 34, working logistics for a shipping company in Charlotte, stretched thin between a mortgage and 2 kids under 5. She knew what it was to be stretched thin. She'd spent most of his childhood that way herself. What she minded, though she would never have said this to anyone, was the card itself. It was one of those generic ones from the drugstore. Blue border. Gold lettering. Wishing you a wonderful day. Signed Daniel, Kristen, and the kids. Kristen's handwriting. Not his. She put it on the windowsill next to a small framed photo and didn't think about it again. The photo was old. 1987. Fort Benning, Georgia. Eleanor in her first dress uniform, 26 years old, standing so straight it looked like someone had run a rod through her spine. She was smiling in it, not the kind of smile you perform for a camera, but the kind that happens before you remember you're being photographed. The kind that means something. She'd joined the Army at 23, after 2 years of nursing school and a conversation with a recruiter that lasted 40 minutes and changed everything. Her mother hadn't understood it. Ruth Ellen Carpenter was a woman who believed in roots, in staying close, in Sunday dinners, in knowing your neighbors by name. The military meant moving. It meant distance. It meant her daughter calling from places Ruth Ellen couldn't find on a map without her reading glasses. But she never asked Eleanor to come home. That was the thing about Ruth Ellen Carpenter. She never asked. Eleanor rose through the ranks the way people do when they are quietly exceptional and never ask for recognition. Steadily, without drama, accumulating trust the way other people accumulate debt. She was a surgical nurse first, then a nurse practitioner, then a commissioned officer in the Army Nurse Corps. She did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She spent 14 months at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, receiving soldiers who came off transport planes in conditions she still didn't describe to civilians because there was no point. Words didn't carry the weight of it. You either knew or you didn't. She made lieutenant colonel at 47. She retired at 58 with 31 years of service, a record that filled 4 pages of commendations, and a pension that covered her rent and her groceries and not much else. She had been married for 19 of those years. Gerald Marsh was a civil engineer she met at a friend's dinner party in Alexandria in 1991. He was tall and careful with his words, and he looked at her across the table that first night like she was something he hadn't expected to find. She married him 11 months later in a small ceremony at a chapel on base. Her mother wore blue. Dolores Marsh wore an expression Eleanor would spend the next 2 decades trying to interpret. The marriage wasn't bad, not at first. It was just misaligned. 2 people who loved each other in good faith but wanted different shapes of life. Gerald wanted evenings at home and weekends without schedules, and a wife who was present in the way he understood presence. Eleanor wanted those things too, in theory. In practice, she was usually 3 time zones away. They divorced in 2009. Quietly. No attorneys screaming across conference tables. No children used as leverage. Just 2 people sitting in a mediator's office in Fairfax, Virginia, dividing a life into columns. Eleanor signed everything Gerald asked for. The house in Alexandria, her name on the mortgage, her salary that paid it down for 11 years. She let him keep it. Because their son was 17 and still living there, and she thought stability mattered more than principle at 17. She thought a lot of things back then that she later revised. She walked out of the mediator's office with her military pension, her uniforms, her mother's recipe box, and a clarity she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly. More like the feeling after a long surgery, the exhaustion and the stillness that comes when the hardest part is finally done. What she didn't walk out with was any standing in the Marsh family. Not that she'd ever really had it. She drove to Roanoke after the retirement ceremony in 2021. Moved into the studio on Jefferson Street, 4 blocks from her mother's house. Close enough to have dinner on Sundays. Close enough to sit under that oak tree in the evenings and drink sweet tea and pretend, for a few hours a week, that she had never left. Those 2 years were the best she could remember in a long time. And then Ruth Ellen Carpenter had a stroke on a Tuesday morning in October, and Eleanor was on a transport out of Fort Bragg before she even understood what was happening, and she landed 12 minutes too late, and everything that had been holding steady came apart at once. She was still standing at the grave when she realized she hadn't eaten since the day before. She was still standing there when the phone rang. Dolores Marsh was 78 years old and had never once in her life said a difficult thing quietly when she could say it loud enough to land. Eleanor had understood this within the first hour of meeting her. Thanksgiving, 1991, a house in McLean, Virginia, dark wood furniture, and a dining table long enough to seat 12. Dolores at the head of it, not Gerald's father. Gerald's father was a soft-spoken man named Howard who passed the gravy and asked polite questions and died of a heart attack in 2004 without ever once raising his voice at anyone. Eleanor had liked Howard. She thought about him sometimes, wondered what the marriage had been like from his side. What it cost a quiet man to spend 40 years beside a woman who treated every conversation like a verdict. The first thing Dolores said to Eleanor that Thanksgiving was not hello. It was, Gerald tells me you're in the military. Is that permanent? Not what do you do? Not, tell me about yourself. Is that permanent? Like it was a condition she was hoping would resolve. Eleanor had smiled and said yes, she intended to make a career of it. Dolores had looked at her for a long moment with an expression Eleanor could not quite read and then turned to ask someone else to pass the rolls. That was the beginning. Over the next 32 years, Dolores refined her technique. She never screamed, never threw things, never said anything that could be repeated at a dinner table and agreed upon as clearly wrong. She was surgical about it in a way that Eleanor, who was herself surgical by training, could only observe with a kind of grim professional respect. There were the holiday invitations that arrived a day too late to change plans. The family photographs where Eleanor was cropped to the edge, then eventually not included at all. The comments delivered in a tone of innocent observation. "Eleanor, you look tired. Is the army very stressful? I always thought it seemed like a young person's life." The way Dolores referred to the house in Alexandria, the house Eleanor's salary had paid for, as Gerald's house, so consistently and for so long that Eleanor had eventually stopped correcting it. And there was the conversation in 2009, 3 days after the divorce was finalized, when Dolores called Eleanor directly, not Gerald, Eleanor, and said, "I want you to know I bear you no ill will. I simply think this is better for everyone. Gerald needs someone who can be present. You were never really here, even when you were here." Eleanor had been in Germany at the time. She remembered standing in her quarters at Landstuhl, phone against her ear, watching snow fall outside a window she couldn't open, thinking, 32 years of holidays, Eleanor, 32 years of biting your tongue at that table, and this is how it ends. With a phone call to a country she can't find on a map. She had said, "Thank you for calling, Dolores," and she had hung up. That was the last time they spoke directly until the morning of Ruth Ellen Carpenter's burial. The service ended at 11:15. The pastor, Brother William, who had known Eleanor's mother since 1983 and wept openly during the eulogy in a way Eleanor found both embarrassing and deeply comforting, shook Eleanor's hand at the end and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. He didn't say anything. He just held her hand and nodded, and that was enough. The other mourners filtered out slowly. There weren't many. Ruth Ellen had outlived most of her friends. A few neighbors. 2 women from her church quilting circle. A man named Carl who had lived next door for 20 years and brought casseroles every time Eleanor's mother was sick, and who stood at the edge of the grave with his hat in his hands and looked like he was trying very hard not to come apart. Eleanor stayed after everyone left. She didn't have anywhere to be. She had taken 2 weeks of leave, old habits. She still thought in terms of leave, even 3 years into retirement, and the apartment on Jefferson Street would be exactly as quiet in an hour as it was now. She stayed because the idea of walking away felt wrong. Like leaving a conversation mid-sentence. She crouched down and pressed the carnations into the fresh soil at the base of the headstone. White ones, from the gas station on Route 220. She'd apologized to her mother for the gas station carnations. Out loud, quietly standing there alone. She thought her mother would have laughed at that. Ruth Ellen Carpenter was not a woman who cared about the provenance of flowers. She was still crouched there, her hand flat against the soil, when the phone rang. She saw the name. Dolores Marsh. She stood up slowly. Her knees had been bothering her since the flight. She'd been sitting too long in too small a space, the way military transport never quite accommodates a body that isn't 22 years old anymore. She stood up and she looked at the name on the screen and she felt something she could only describe later as recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. The way you recognize the weather changing before you can explain how you knew. She answered. "Your mother just died." "Good. Now you have somewhere to go." A pause. Not a long one. "Because you will not be buried beside this family. I filed the paperwork this morning. Your name has been removed from the Marsh family plot. I wanted you to hear it from me directly." Eleanor said nothing. The October wind moved through the cemetery in a long, slow pull, bending the grass along the rows of headstones. Somewhere behind her a crow landed on a stone marker and sat there with the particular stillness of something that has nowhere better to be. "I'm sure you'll understand," Dolores said. "You never really belonged there anyway." Still, Eleanor said nothing. This was something she had learned in 30 years of surgery and command and impossible situations. That silence is not the same as weakness. That sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to give a moment more weight than it deserves by reacting to it. She had held that discipline in operating rooms with soldiers who were not going to make it. She had held it in briefing rooms with generals who were wrong and knew it. She had held it in a mediator's office in Fairfax, Virginia, signing away a house she'd paid for. She held it now. "I hope you have a nice service," Dolores said. And then she was gone. 4 minutes and 9 seconds. Eleanor lowered the phone. She looked at her mother's headstone, Ruth Ellen Carpenter, beloved mother, at rest, and she felt the full weight of the morning settle onto her at once. Not just the call. All of it. The transport. The 12 minutes. The gas station carnations. The pastor crying. Carl with his hat. The way the grave still smelled like turned earth, clean and dark and final. She sat down in the folding chair someone had left. For the first time all morning, she sat down. She did not cry. Not because she was too strong to cry. She had learned long ago that strength and tears have nothing to do with each other. She didn't cry because she was past it. Past the place where crying would have helped. She was in the quieter country beyond grief, where everything is simply what it is and you just have to figure out how to carry it. She sat there for a long time. The crow was still on the headstone when she finally stood up. She looked at it. It looked at her. Then she picked up her purse, straightened her coat, and walked back to her car. She had 32 years of small cruelties behind her and a 7-day drive ahead of her to something she couldn't name yet. She didn't know it was coming, but it was already on its way. The last real conversation Eleanor had with her mother was on a Thursday. Not the last phone call. That was a Sunday 6 days before the stroke, and it was brief in the way calls get brief when two people have talked so long and so often that they've stopped needing to fill the silence. Ruth Ellen had asked about Eleanor's knee. Eleanor had asked about the garden. Ruth Ellen said the dahlias were finally coming in right, and she'd been having trouble with the deer again, and Carl next door had offered to put up a fence, but she didn't want to make a fuss. Eleanor said she'd look at it when she came for Thanksgiving. Ruth Ellen said that would be nice. That was it. That was the last one. But the last real conversation, the kind where something true passes between two people, was a Thursday in August, 6 weeks before Ruth Ellen died. Eleanor had driven over for dinner. Nothing special. Pot roast, the way her mother had always made it, with carrots cut too thick and bread from the bakery on Elm Street. They ate at the kitchen table with the window open because the evenings were still warm and Ruth Ellen liked the sound of the neighborhood at dusk. Children, sprinklers, someone mowing a lawn at the far edge of hearing. After dinner, they sat on the porch under the oak tree with their sweet tea, and Ruth Ellen said, out of nowhere, the way she sometimes did when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally decided to say it, "Do you think you did the right thing? With your life, I mean. The army. All of it." Eleanor had looked at her mother for a moment. Ruth Ellen was watching the street, not Eleanor. Her hands were folded in her lap the way they always were when she was being careful. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think so. Even with everything it cost?" "Even then." Ruth Ellen nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she said, "Good. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I knew that. That I always knew." Eleanor didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she could. They sat there until the light was gone and the fireflies started up in the yard. And then Ruth Ellen said she was tired and Eleanor helped her inside and washed the dishes while her mother went to bed. She stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the oak tree in the dark, and she thought, she remembered thinking this specifically, I should stay tonight. I could sleep on the couch. There's no reason to drive back. But she didn't stay. She had an early appointment. Something administrative, something that could have been rescheduled, something she could not now tell you the details of if her life depended on it. She kissed her mother on the forehead and drove back to Jefferson Street. 6 weeks later, Ruth Ellen Carpenter had a stroke at 5:50 a.m. on a Tuesday. Alone in her bedroom. Carl next door heard the fall and called 911. The paramedics were there in 8 minutes. They did everything right. It wasn't enough. Eleanor was at Fort Bragg for a Veterans Advocacy Conference when the hospital called. She got the first available transport. She sat in a jump seat for 4 hours with her hands folded in her lap the way her mother used to fold hers, staring at nothing, bargaining with a god she wasn't sure she believed in the way she did when she was young. She landed at 6:14. Her mother passed at 6:02. 12 minutes. She thought about that Thursday often in the days after the burial. The pot roast. The open window. The oak tree going dark. I always knew. She thought about it the way you think about something that almost makes sense but not quite, like a word on the tip of your tongue, like a door you can see but can't find the handle to. What had her mother always known? That Eleanor had made the right choice? That the cost was worth it? Or something else, something quieter, something Ruth Ellen had never said directly because she was not a woman who said things directly when a steady presence could say it better. Eleanor sat with that question for a long time. She sat with the other one too. The harder one. The one that started with, "I should have stayed that Thursday." She was a surgeon's mind and a nurse's body. She had spent 3 decades diagnosing, assessing, deciding. She knew how to look at a situation clearly without flinching. And looking clearly at the Thursday in August, she could see exactly what she had done. She had felt the pull to stay. She had recognized it. She had chosen the early appointment instead. Not because she didn't love her mother. Because loving someone and being present for them are 2 different skills, and Eleanor Marsh had spent 30 years mastering the first one and never quite getting the second right. She knew this about herself. She had known it for a long time. Gerald had known it too. That was the part she never said out loud. Not to him, not to Daniel, not to anyone. Gerald hadn't been wrong about her. Not entirely. She had been difficult to be married to in ways that had nothing to do with deployment schedules and everything to do with who she was. She kept things inside because the inside was where she was most comfortable. She solved problems instead of feeling them. She showed up for strangers in crisis with more instinctive grace than she showed up for the people who loved her in ordinary time. She had been a better officer than she was a wife. She had been a better colleague than she was a mother. She had been many fine and honorable things, and she had paid for them with a currency she didn't always know she was spending until the account was lower than she'd realized. The divorce papers hadn't surprised her. Not because she'd wanted them. She hadn't. She had wanted the marriage to work the way she wanted most things to work, through effort and discipline and the refusal to accept failure. But somewhere in the 3rd year of the second Iraq deployment, lying in a bunk at Camp Victory, listening to the night, she had understood that wanting something to work is not the same as being able to make it work, and that the gap between those 2 things can swallow a marriage whole. She had signed the papers without fighting because fighting felt dishonest. Because she knew what she'd given and what she hadn't. Because she thought, and this was the part she most regretted now, sitting in her mother's absence, that she was being noble. That her willingness to absorb the loss without argument was a kind of integrity. What she understood now, 3 years into retirement and 61 years old and standing at the edge of everything she'd thought she'd built, was that sometimes what looks like integrity is just an old habit of making yourself small. She had let Dolores Marsh take things from her for 32 years because she thought not reacting was the same as being above it. It wasn't. It was just 32 years of swallowed words and uncashed debts and a family plot she'd helped pay for with her name slowly being erased from it. There was one more thing Eleanor had never told anyone. The medal. In 2003, during her second tour in Iraq, Eleanor had performed emergency surgery on 4 soldiers in a field hospital outside Mosul during a mortar attack that destroyed 2 of the 3 generators and killed the anesthesiologist. She'd worked by flashlight for 6 hours. 2 of the 4 soldiers survived. She had made the decisions about which 2 in the time it takes most people to choose between items on a menu. She had received a commendation for it. A significant one. She had never told Gerald. Not because it wasn't important. It was the most important thing she had ever done and the most terrible, but because the reason those 2 soldiers lived was also the reason the other 2 didn't, and she had never found a way to explain that to someone who hadn't been in that room. Who hadn't made that choice with a flashlight in one hand and 30 years of training in the other, and the absolute knowledge that there was no option that didn't cost something irreplaceable. She carried that room with her the way soldiers carry things. Quietly. Without complaint. In a part of herself she didn't open for guests. She had not opened it for Gerald. She had not opened it for Dolores. She had barely opened it for herself. But she had opened it for her mother. Not all of it. Not the details. But the weight of it. Ruth Ellen had known the weight. The way she looked at Eleanor sometimes across a dinner table or a porch railing, with that particular steadiness that said, "I don't need to understand it. I just need you to know I'm not afraid of it." That was what Eleanor had lost when she lost her mother. The one person who could hold the weight without needing it explained. She sat in the studio apartment on Jefferson Street for days after the burial, with a cup of coffee gone cold and the small framed photo on the windowsill. Fort Benning, 1987, 26 years old, smiling before she remembered the camera, and she thought, "There is no one left who knows the whole of me." And then, because she was Eleanor Marsh and this was what she did, she stood up, rinsed the cup, put on her coat, and went for a walk. The oak tree on Elm Street still had most of its leaves. She stood under it for a while. Then she went home. The first time Dolores Marsh made Eleanor feel like a guest in her own marriage, it was Christmas, 1992. Eleanor had been married 14 months. She was 27 years old and still learning how to be someone's wife in the margins of being a soldier, still figuring out which version of herself to bring to which room. She had driven up from Fort Belvoir on Christmas Eve with a casserole she'd made from her mother's recipe and a bottle of wine she'd agonized over in the store for 20 minutes and a kind of hopeful nervousness she would later be embarrassed to remember. The casserole was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not inedible. Just wrong in the particular way that things are wrong when a woman has already decided they will be. Dolores looked at it the way you look at something you've been expecting to disappoint you and said, "How thoughtful. We usually do a roast, but this will be fine." Fine. Eleanor had eaten the word and smiled and helped clear the table. That was the template. That was how it worked for 32 years. Dolores delivering the verdict in a tone of mild benevolence, Eleanor absorbing it with the discipline she'd developed for situations that required composure. The difference was that in the situations that required composure, Eleanor had a role, a rank, a clear purpose. In Dolores Marsh's dining room, she was simply Gerald's wife, and Gerald's wife was a category Dolores had already filled in her imagination long before Eleanor arrived to occupy it. The woman Dolores had imagined for Gerald was someone local, someone rooted, someone who would have the same kitchen curtains for 20 years and know which neighbors to invite to which gatherings and build a life in a particular place in a particular way that Dolores recognized as a life. Eleanor was none of those things. Eleanor was a woman who repacked her household every 2 to 4 years and had strong opinions about field dressings and once spent Christmas in Germany and called from a phone booth to say she was sorry she couldn't make it. She could not make it twice in 30 years. Dolores mentioned it 12 times. Eleanor had tried. This was the part no one would have known from the outside, because she was not a woman who catalogued her efforts or asked for recognition of them. But she had tried, genuinely, repeatedly, with the same methodical persistence she brought to every problem that mattered to her. She had learned Dolores's preferences. The particular brand of coffee. The way she liked the salad dressed, with lemon not vinegar. The grandchildren's birthdays, all 7 of them, committed to memory and marked in advance. She had sent cards. She had called on holidays. She had, in 2001, arranged for Gerald's parents to fly to Germany and stay for a week so they could see where Eleanor was stationed, what she did, what her life looked like outside the narrow frame of their dining room. Dolores had come. She had looked at everything with careful, attentive eyes. She had asked polite questions. She had said on the flight home, according to Gerald, that she supposed it made sense for some people, but she couldn't imagine living so far from everything familiar. Everything familiar. Eleanor had thought about that phrase for a long time. She understood what it meant and what it didn't mean. What it meant was, I cannot expand my understanding of what a good life looks like to include yours. What it didn't mean was anything personal. Dolores didn't dislike Eleanor specifically. She disliked the shape of Eleanor's life. She disliked that it didn't fit any category she had a word for. And because Dolores was a woman who needed words for things, who needed to know where everything went and what everything meant, Eleanor remained, for 32 years, an item she couldn't quite file. That would have been bearable. Strange, lonely, but bearable. What made it something else was the property. The house in Alexandria had been purchased in 1994 with a down payment that came entirely from Eleanor's deployment savings. She had spent 2 years in Korea and 14 months in Germany before they bought it, living in base quarters, spending almost nothing, because she had understood from the beginning that mobility was expensive, and she wanted to have something to offer when the time came for Gerald to stop moving and start building. The mortgage was in both their names. The down payment was hers. She had never made a point of this. Not once in 15 years of paying it had she said, "This is mine. I built this. This comes from me." Because it wasn't a transaction to her. It was a marriage. What was hers was theirs. That was how she understood it. She understood it differently after the divorce. The mediator's office in Fairfax, Virginia. A Tuesday afternoon in November 2009. Gray sky outside. Coffee nobody had touched. Gerald across the table looking at a spot somewhere left of Eleanor's shoulder, because he had always had difficulty looking directly at things that hurt him. His attorney, a small careful man named Briggs, arranging papers. Eleanor's attorney had suggested she contest the house. Eleanor had said no. Not because she didn't know she had a claim. She knew exactly what she had a claim to. But Daniel was 17 and in his junior year, and she calculated everything. That was who she was, that the disruption of making her son move in his junior year would cost more than the house was worth. She had made the decision the way she made surgical decisions. Assessed the variables. Chosen the outcome that caused the least damage to the thing she was trying to protect. She signed the papers. Gerald kept the house. Dolores, when she heard, called it the right thing. Like Eleanor had finally done something comprehensible. What Dolores did not know, what Gerald may not have fully understood either, was that Eleanor had also been the one to recommend him for the senior engineering position at Donovan and Associates in 2004. She had met Richard Donovan at a function in Washington, a veterans advocacy dinner, and they had talked for an hour, and she had mentioned Gerald's name and sent a follow-up email the next day with a brief, specific, factual account of his capabilities. Gerald got the interview. Gerald got the job. Gerald's salary doubled in 3 years. Eleanor told no one. There was nothing to tell, she thought. She had helped her husband. That was what you did. She thought about it sometimes after the divorce. Not with bitterness exactly. More with the specific exhaustion of someone who has finally understood a pattern they've been inside too long to see clearly. After the divorce, Dolores's methods shifted. Before, Eleanor had been a target of mild condescension, the wrong casserole, the missed Christmas, the too long absences. After, she was something more categorical. She was the ex-wife. She was the woman who hadn't been present enough. She was, in the story Dolores told at family dinners and holiday gatherings and any gathering where the shape of Gerald's life came up, the reason things had gone the way they went. Eleanor heard some of this through Daniel. Not because Daniel volunteered it, he was careful, her son, careful in the way children of difficult marriages learn to be careful, but because there were moments when he couldn't hold it all in and something slipped. Grandma says you chose your career over Dad. Grandma says the house would have been different if you'd been home more. Grandma says. Eleanor always stopped him there. Not sharply. Just, you don't have to tell me what Grandma says, Daniel. I know. She did know. What she hadn't fully grasped, until the phone rang in Section C, Row 14 of Roanoke Memorial Gardens, was that Dolores had been building toward something all along. Not impulsively, not in anger. Dolores was not an impulsive woman. She was a woman who planned, who waited, who understood that the right moment is more powerful than the right argument. The right moment, it turned out, was a Tuesday morning in October. A cemetery. A grave still open. A daughter who had just lost her mother and had nowhere left to stand. Dolores had filed the paperwork at 8 a.m. Eleanor's mother had been gone for 6 hours. It was, Eleanor would later think, almost impressive in its precision. Like a surgical strike from someone who had never held a scalpel but had studied the anatomy for 30 years. She knew exactly where to cut. She knew exactly when. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have planned for, was what was already in the mail. 7 days before Ruth Ellen Carpenter's funeral, a clerk at the Department of Veterans Affairs office in Richmond, Virginia, had processed a routine request. It was not a large request. It was not complicated. It was the kind of paperwork that moves through government offices every week, signed by people who will never meet the person the paperwork is for. The request was for a government-issued headstone. For a veteran. Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Ruth Marsh, Army Nurse Corps, United States Army. Retired. 31 years of service. Multiple commendations. One particular commendation the clerk noted with a small pause before initialing the form, the kind of pause a person makes when they read something and need a moment before they can move on. The headstone had been ordered months before Ruth Ellen died. Eleanor had filled out the paperwork in the spring, when she was thinking clearly about practical things, about what comes after, about what she wanted, about the difference between being remembered and being placed. She had specified the cemetery, the section, the style of stone. She had not specified the placement. That decision belonged to the cemetery administration. What she didn't know, filling out that form on a quiet Tuesday morning in her apartment on Jefferson Street, was that Roanoke Memorial Gardens had designated a section for veterans. That the section had a place of honor, a position at the entrance, visible from the road, where the light hit the stone a certain way in the morning. That the cemetery director, a man named Paul Garrett who had served 2 years in the Navy before his knees gave out and who took the veteran section with a seriousness that bordered on the sacred, would review Eleanor's record and make a decision without hesitation. She didn't know any of that. She had filled out the form. She had sent it in. She had gone on with her life, which was what she always did. The granite was already cut. The truck was already scheduled. Dolores Marsh had filed her paperwork at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, very pleased with her precision, very certain she had said the last word. She had not said the last word. She was not even close. 7 days after Ruth Ellen Carpenter's burial, Eleanor drove back to Roanoke Memorial Gardens alone. She hadn't planned to. She had gotten up that Tuesday morning the way she'd gotten up every morning since the funeral, early before light, because her body had never learned to sleep past 5 regardless of what the day required, made coffee, stood at the window on Jefferson Street watching the neighborhood come awake, and told herself she was going to do something practical. Clean out her mother's recipe box. Call the utilities company. Return the casserole dish to the woman from the quilting circle who had left it on the porch with a note that said thinking of you, Eloise, wrong name, but the gesture was real. She did none of those things. At 7:15 she put on her coat and got in the car. She told herself she just needed to see it again. The headstone. Her mother's name carved in granite, Ruth Ellen Carpenter, beloved mother, at rest. She needed to see it in ordinary daylight, without the casket and the pastor and the folding chairs and the weight of ceremony pressing down on everything. She needed to see it as just a place. A place her mother was. A place she could come back to. She parked at the entrance and walked in through the iron gate, past the office where Paul Garrett's truck sat idling in the small lot, past the row of spruce trees along the eastern fence that smelled like cold and pine and something else she couldn't name. October had deepened since the funeral. The leaves were down now on the maples. The grass had that particular brittle quality of grass that has given up on warmth for the year. She walked to Section C without looking up. She found row 14. She stood there. She had brought more white carnations, a proper bunch this time, from the florist on Campbell Avenue, not the gas station. She crouched down to arrange them at the base of the stone and stayed there for a while with her hand flat against the ground, feeling the cold come up through the soil, thinking about nothing in particular, and everything at once the way the mind does when it has stopped trying to manage itself. She was still crouched there when she heard the truck. Not a small truck. The sound of it came through the ground before it came through the air, a low vibration, the kind that belongs to something carrying weight. She heard it turn through the entrance gate, heard the tires on the cemetery path, heard it slow and stop somewhere behind her. She didn't turn around. She thought it was the groundskeeping crew. She thought she would finish with the flowers and give them space to work. She heard doors open. 2 of them. She heard footsteps on gravel, deliberate and measured, not the footsteps of groundskeepers. She knew the sound of deliberate and measured. She had spent 30 years making that sound herself. She turned around. 2 men in dress uniform. Army. One a staff sergeant, young, early 30s, holding a clipboard. The other older, a master sergeant with the particular bearing of someone who has done this specific thing many times and has never once treated it as routine. Behind them, the truck, a government vehicle, gray, with a flatbed carrying something covered in a moving blanket secured with straps. The master sergeant looked at her directly. "Ma'am, are you Eleanor Ruth Marsh?" She stood up slowly. Her knees again. She pressed her hand against her thigh to straighten. "I am," she said. He nodded once. "We have a delivery for you, ma'am. Government-issued veteran's headstone, requested by the named veteran. Placement pre-authorized by Roanoke Memorial Gardens Administration." She looked at him, then at the truck, then back at him. "I filed that paperwork in the spring," she said. It wasn't a question. She was just placing it, trying to locate this moment in the sequence of her life, find where it connected. Yes, ma'am. Processing and fabrication take time. We apologize for the delay. There's no delay, she said. I'm here. The master sergeant looked at her for a moment, something passing across his face that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood, and then he nodded to the staff sergeant, who began undoing the straps on the flatbed. Paul Garrett came out of the office before they had the stone fully uncovered. He walked quickly for a man with bad knees. Eleanor noticed this and recognized it, across the small lot and through the spruce trees to where they were standing. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s with a white mustache and the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work and possibly some grief of his own. He had a radio on his belt and a set of keys that clinked when he moved, and he arrived slightly out of breath. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the stone, now uncovered. White granite. Rectangular. Standard government issue. The kind Eleanor had seen in military cemeteries from Virginia to Germany. Her name carved in clean block letters across the top. Eleanor Ruth Marsh. Below that, her rank and branch. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. Below that, her years of service. 1971 to 2021. And at the bottom, 3 words. Served with distinction. Paul Garrett took off his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands, and he looked at the stone, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "Follow me. I know exactly where this goes." The veterans section was at the front of the cemetery, along the main path from the entrance gate. Eleanor had walked past it every time she'd visited her mother, had noticed it the way you notice something that belongs to a world adjacent to yours, present but not quite personal. Rows of government-issue stones in the morning light. Flags on the smaller markers. A quietness to that section that was different from the quietness of the rest of the cemetery. More deliberate, more held. Paul Garrett led them to the entrance of the section. There was a position there. Eleanor saw it now, had not registered it before, a place set slightly apart from the rows, at the corner where the main path turned. A prepared foundation, concrete, already set. The light hit it from the east in the morning. She could see how it would. The stone would catch the light before anything else in the section caught it. This position, Paul Garrett said, is for decorated veterans. We've had it prepared for 6 months. We've been waiting for the right stone. Eleanor looked at the foundation. She looked at the position. She thought about the spring morning when she had filled out the paperwork at her kitchen table on Jefferson Street, the ordinary practical task of deciding where she wanted to be placed, and how it had not occurred to her then that the placement would be someone else's decision, and that the someone else would be a man with bad knees and a white mustache who would take off his hat before he even knew her name. The 2 soldiers carried the stone. It took both of them. Granite is heavier than it looks, and this piece was substantial. They set it into the prepared foundation with the careful, practiced movements of men who have done this in heat and cold and wind and have learned that the only acceptable standard is exactly right. It settled into place with a sound Eleanor felt more than heard. A low finality. The kind of sound that means something is exactly where it belongs. She stood at the edge of the path and looked at it. Her name in the morning light. Served with distinction. She thought about the field hospital outside Mosul. The flashlight. The generators going dark one by one. The 4 soldiers and the decisions she'd made in the space between heartbeats. Decisions she had carried in the closed room of herself for 20 years without complaint and without explanation and without anyone to set them down with. She thought about her mother's kitchen. The pot roast. The open window. I always knew. She thought about the phone call in Section C, Row 14 7 days ago. Dolores Marsh's voice, flat and certain. You will not be buried beside this family. She was not beside that family. She was at the entrance of the veterans section of Roanoke Memorial Gardens, in the position reserved for decorated veterans, in the morning light, with her name in white granite facing the road where anyone who drove past could read it. She was, it turned out, exactly where she was supposed to be. The staff sergeant offered her the clipboard for a signature. She signed. Her handwriting was what it had always been, precise, no flourishes, the signature of someone who had signed a great many important documents and understood that legibility mattered more than style. The master sergeant folded the moving blanket carefully and tucked it under his arm. Is there anything else we can do for you, ma'am? Eleanor looked at the stone one more time. No, she said. This is everything. He nodded. Thank you for your service, Colonel. She almost said, Lieutenant Colonel. Almost corrected it, the way she would have automatically 20 years ago, in a world where rank was a daily currency and precision mattered in every denomination. She didn't correct it. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing it." She sat on the bench at the edge of the veterans section for a long time after they left. Paul Garrett brought her a cup of coffee from the office without asking if she wanted one. He set it on the bench beside her and went back inside without a word, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she appreciated it more than she could have explained. The coffee was too strong. She drank all of it. She sat there and she looked at her name in the granite and she thought about the word distinction. What it meant. Where it came from. She had always found the commendation language a little formal, a little removed from the actual texture of what it described, as if the official words existed in a parallel world where things were clean and categorical and the weight of a decision could be expressed in a sentence. Served with distinction. What it meant, in practice, was she had been in a room where everything was going wrong and she had not left the room. She had stayed. She had done what she could do. She had made choices no one should have to make, and she had made them anyway, and she had carried them quietly for 20 years without asking anyone to carry them with her. That was distinction, apparently. She supposed it was. The morning light moved on the granite, and she thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that distinction and loneliness can live in the same body for a very long time without ever resolving into something simpler. She had been lonely. She could say that now. Not always, not completely. She had had her mother. She had had her soldiers. She had had the particular companionship of shared purpose that military service gives you and that nothing else quite replicates. But in the spaces between those things, in the marriages and the dining rooms and the phone calls from women who filed paperwork at 8 in the morning to make sure you had nowhere to go, yes, she had been lonely. She finished the coffee. She stood up, straightened her coat, looked one more time at the stone. Then she walked back to her mother's grave in Section C, row 14, and she sat down again in the folding chair someone had left, and she said, out loud, quietly, to no one who could answer, "Someone's going to have to move that chair eventually." She thought her mother would have laughed at that too. The crow was gone. The carnations were still white. She stayed until the light shifted, and then she went home to make a phone call she had been putting off for 7 days. Gerald Marsh heard about the headstone from Paul Garrett. Not directly. Gerald didn't know Paul Garrett, had never been to Roanoke Memorial Gardens, had in fact not been to Roanoke at all since the divorce except once briefly, when Daniel was playing in a youth soccer tournament and Gerald had driven down and stood on the sideline and driven back the same day without calling Eleanor. But Paul Garrett knew the Marsh family plot. He had managed that cemetery for 19 years and he knew every family with a plot the way a librarian knows the books, not intimately, not personally, but with a catalogued awareness of where things were and what they meant and when something had changed. He had known the week before, when the paperwork came through to remove Eleanor's name from the Marsh plot. He had processed it because it was legal and properly filed, and his job was not to have opinions about paperwork. But he had noted it. The way you note something that feels wrong without being wrong in any way you can point to. And then, 7 days later, Eleanor Marsh had been standing in Section C when his truck came through the gate, and he had watched 2 soldiers in dress uniform carry a government-issue granite headstone to the position of honor at the entrance of the veterans section, and he had taken off his hat and he had thought, well, just that. Well, he mentioned it to his assistant, a woman named Beverly who had worked at the cemetery for 11 years and who knew the Marsh family plot because Dolores Marsh called every spring to confirm the maintenance schedule and was very specific about the flowers. Beverly mentioned it to her sister. Her sister's husband worked at the Roanoke City Planning Office and had gone to high school with Gerald Marsh's younger brother, which was the kind of connection that exists everywhere in a mid-sized Virginia city and that people underestimate until it matters. By the time it reached Gerald, it had passed through 4 people and taken on the particular texture of a story that everyone agrees is significant without quite agreeing on why. Gerald called Daniel. Eleanor was in her mother's house on Elm Street when her phone rang. She had finally started the work of sorting. The recipe box, the kitchen cabinets, the closet in the back bedroom where Ruth Ellen had kept 40 years of accumulated careful living in labeled boxes that broke Eleanor's heart one at a time. She was sitting on the floor of the back bedroom with a box of old photographs in her lap when Daniel called. She almost didn't answer. Then she did, the way she always did. "Mom." His voice had a particular quality she recognized. Not upset exactly. More like someone who has been carrying something for a few days and has decided the carrying is harder than the putting down. Daniel. Dad called me. She set the photographs aside. All right. He heard about the headstone. From someone who knows the cemetery director. A puss. He wanted to know if you were okay. Eleanor looked at the box of photographs in her lap. On top was a picture of herself at approximately 7 years old, standing in the front yard on Elm Street in a dress she didn't remember, squinting into the sun. Her mother's hand was visible at the edge of the frame. Just the hand, reaching toward her, slightly blurred, like she'd been moving when the shutter clicked. Tell your father I'm fine, she said. Tell him thank you for asking. He also said. Daniel stopped. She could hear him deciding something. He said Grandma knows. Someone told her. He said she's been. Another stop. He said she hasn't been herself. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? She said. Not sharply. Just the question. He said she hasn't left the house since she heard. That's 3 days. He said she's not answering the phone. Eleanor looked at the blurred hand at the edge of the photograph. She'll be all right, she said. Mom. She's a sturdy woman, Daniel. She'll be all right. She said goodbye. She sat on the floor of her mother's back bedroom for a while longer. Then she put the box of photographs aside, stood up, and went to make dinner in a kitchen that still smelled like Ruth Ellen Carpenter's pot roast, even though no one had cooked in it for 2 weeks. Dolores Marsh heard about the headstone on a Wednesday afternoon from her neighbor Margaret, who had heard it from her daughter, who had gotten it from Beverly's sister's husband through the chain of connections that smaller cities maintain without effort or intention. Margaret delivered it the way neighbors deliver things they know will land hard, with an expression of careful sympathy that is also underneath, the expression of someone who finds the situation interesting. She sat in Dolores's living room with her tea and said, I heard something about Eleanor. About a headstone the government sent to Roanoke Memorial. Margaret Pruitt's son-in-law mentioned it. Apparently it's quite something. Dolores said, Is that right? Not a question. Margaret elaborated. The veterans section. The position of honor. The position at the entrance where the light hit it first in the morning. Served with distinction in the granite. Dolores said nothing through any of this. She sat with her tea in her lap and her back straight the way it had always been straight. She was 78 years old and she had never once in her life allowed her posture to reflect what she was feeling, and she let Margaret talk. After Margaret left, she sat in the living room alone for a long time. The room was familiar to her in the way rooms become familiar when you have sat in them through enough versions of your life. The dark wood furniture. The photographs on the mantel. Gerald at various ages. The grandchildren, Howard in his good suit on their wedding day. There was no photograph of Eleanor anywhere in the room. There had been one once, early in the marriage, a small one tucked at the end of the mantel, Eleanor and Gerald at some military function, Eleanor in dress uniform, Gerald looking slightly uncomfortable in a way he always did at formal events. Dolores had moved it to a drawer sometime around 2005. She couldn't remember exactly when. It had seemed like a reasonable thing to do at the time. She went to the drawer now. She didn't know why. She wasn't thinking clearly enough to know why she was doing anything. She opened the drawer and moved aside the things on top, the spare batteries, the takeout menus nobody used anymore, the birthday cards she'd been meaning to throw away, and she found the photograph at the bottom. Eleanor in dress uniform. Dolores had always found the uniform unsettling. Not because it was military. Howard had served briefly, years ago, and she respected service in the abstract, but because Eleanor in uniform looked like a different person than the Eleanor who sat at her dining room table. In the uniform she looked certain. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. She looked like someone who did not require Dolores's approval or anyone else's. Dolores had not known what to do with a woman who did not require her approval. She sat with the photograph for a long time. Gerald came the next morning. He drove down from Alexandria, 3.5 hours, which was not a trip he made casually, and arrived before 10. Dolores heard his car in the driveway and went to the window and watched him come up the walk with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it did when he was carrying something difficult. He had his father's face. She had always been grateful for that. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. He didn't bring it up immediately. They talked about the grandchildren for a few minutes, about the drive, about the weather. Gerald had always needed a runway before the hard thing. She had always found this maddening and had also, if she was honest, cultivated it. She had filled the space around difficult conversations with her son since he was small, made it clear that certain things required careful approach, and he had learned the approach so well that now she couldn't undo it even when she wanted to. Finally he said, "Mom, tell me what happened." She looked at him across the table. "I made a decision," she said. "About the plot. I'm within my rights. I know you're within your rights. She's not part of this family anymore. I know that's what you believe." Something in the way he said it made her stop. Gerald was not a man who said things pointedly. He was careful with words in the way careful men are, thoughtful, non-confrontational, always looking for the version of the truth that required the least damage to anyone. She had raised him to be that way, and she had been proud of it. He was not being that way now. "What does that mean?" she said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table. "It means I know what you believe," he said. "And I don't think I've ever told you what I actually know. About Eleanor. About who she was." Dolores waited. "She recommended me for Donovan," he said. "The job I've had for 20 years. My career. She recommended me. She met Richard Donovan at a veterans dinner in 2004, and she told him about me, and she sent a follow-up email, and she never told me until we were signing the divorce papers. She mentioned it like it was nothing. Like of course she'd done it. Like what else would she have done?" He looked up then. "She signed over the house, Mom. She paid the down payment. She paid the mortgage for 11 years. She signed it over because Daniel was 17 and she didn't want him to move in his junior year. And she never made me feel..." He stopped. His jaw moved. "She never made me feel small about it. Not once." The kitchen was quiet. "She was in a room in Mosul in 2003, he continued, during a mortar attack with no power and no anesthesiologist, and she performed surgery by flashlight for 6 hours. 2 soldiers lived. She has never, in 20 years, told me what that cost her. Not because she was protecting herself. Because she didn't want me to have to carry it." Dolores looked at her son's face. She had not seen his face look like this before. It was not angry. It was something past anger. The particular expression of someone who has understood something too late and is in the first raw hours of that understanding. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because you filed that paperwork," he said. "On the morning of her mother's funeral. While she was standing at the grave." Dolores said nothing. "I need to know something," Gerald said. He set his cup down. He looked at her directly in a way that reminded her painfully of Howard who had always been able to look directly at things. "Did you know? Did you know who she was, what she'd done, and do it anyway? Or did you genuinely not know?" The question sat in the kitchen between them. Dolores looked at her hands. Her hands were 78 years old. They had held Gerald as a baby and kneaded bread every Sunday for 40 years and folded Howard's shirts after he died and signed documents, and poured tea and done 1,000 ordinary things in the ordinary service of an ordinary life that she had tended with total dedication. She thought about the photograph in the drawer. Eleanor in dress uniform. That certainty. That self-containment. The thing Dolores hadn't known what to do with. She understood now, sitting in her kitchen with her son's question in the air, what she had done with it. She had decided it was arrogance. She had decided that a woman who needed no one's approval must believe herself above approval. She had decided that Eleanor's self-sufficiency was a verdict on everyone around her. She had spent 32 years defending herself against a judgment Eleanor had never actually made. "I didn't know," Dolores said finally. "Not all of it." A pause. "But I knew enough," she said. "I knew enough to know she was more than I gave her credit for. I chose not to look." The word chose cost her something to say. She felt it leave her. Gerald didn't say anything. He didn't reach across the table. He just sat there with his coffee and let her have the moment without commentary, which was the right thing to do, and she recognized it as something Eleanor would have done. She had taught him too well to be like his father. She hadn't noticed, until now, how much of Eleanor was also in there. She didn't call Eleanor that day. Or the next. She sat in the living room with the photograph from the drawer set on the mantel where it used to be, In the space at the end where it had always looked slightly out of place and had also always, she admitted to herself now, looked right. On the third day, she picked up the phone. She held it for a long time. Then she set it back down. She was not ready. She didn't know if she would ever be ready in the way she imagined readiness, some clean moment of certainty where the right words would come and the weight of 32 years would lift. She suspected that was not how it worked. She suspected it worked the way most hard things worked. You did it before you were ready, or you didn't do it at all. She picked up the phone again. Eleanor drove to Roanoke Memorial Gardens on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the headstone was placed. Not because she had planned to. Not because she had decided anything in particular. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in her mother's house. She was staying there now. Not at the apartment on Jefferson Street, because the apartment felt too small for the size of what she was carrying and her mother's house felt too large but in a way she could use, and she had been drinking coffee and looking at the recipe box and she had thought, I should go. So she went. She brought no flowers this time. She didn't know why. Maybe because the carnations were always slightly wrong. Too purchased, too arranged, not the right language for what she wanted to say. She brought nothing. Just herself in her good coat with her hands in her pockets, walking through the iron gate in the early morning before anyone else arrived, past the spruce trees, past the office where Paul Garrett's truck was already parked. She went to the veterans section first. She didn't usually do it in that order. Her mother was in Section C and that was where she went. That was the destination. That was the reason she came. But today she walked to the entrance of the veterans section and stood at the corner where the path turned and looked at the stone in the morning light. It was exactly as Paul Garrett had said it would be. The light hit it first, before the other stones, before anything else in that section. Her name came out of the dark before the rest of the cemetery did. Eleanor Ruth Marsh. There in the granite, clear and permanent and asking nothing of her. She stood there for a while. She was not a woman who talked to stones. She had stood at military cemeteries in 3 countries, and she had never been able to make sense of the talking, the way people leaned down and spoke to the marker as if the marker were the person. The person wasn't there. She knew where the person was and where they weren't, and granite was granite. But she stood there anyway, and she thought some things she didn't put into words, and that was its own kind of conversation. Then she walked to Section C, row 14. Her mother's headstone was simple. Ruth Ellen Carpenter, beloved mother, at rest. Eleanor had chosen those words in a phone call with the monument company 2 weeks before Ruth Ellen died, during the period when the doctors were being carefully noncommittal and Eleanor was being carefully practical, and neither of them was saying what both of them understood. She had chosen beloved mother because it was true, and at rest because her mother had spent 79 years in motion. The garden, the quilting circle, the Sunday dinners, the 4-hour drives to wherever Eleanor was stationed, and the idea of rest seemed like something Ruth Ellen had earned so completely that it belonged on the stone. She sat down in the folding chair. Someone had moved it slightly since the last time, a few inches to the left, probably to mow around it, but it was still there. She appreciated that Paul Garrett hadn't taken it away. She sat in it and she looked at her mother's name and she said, I don't know how to start this. She hadn't planned to speak out loud. It happened the way things happen when you've been holding something long enough. Not a decision, but a release, the way breath releases when you've been holding it without knowing. I've been trying to figure out what I would have said. If I'd made it in time. If I'd had those 12 minutes back. The morning was very still. No wind. The spruce trees along the fence were motionless. Somewhere in the distance a car passed on the road outside the gate, and then it was quiet again. I think I would have said thank you, Eleanor said. Which is I know. I know it's not enough. I know thank you is what you say when someone holds a door. But I think that's actually what I needed to say. Just thank you. For not asking me to be different. For never once asking me to come home when I needed to be somewhere else. For knowing what it cost and not making me explain it. She stopped. A bird landed on the headstone next to her mother's. A small one, a sparrow, which sat there with perfect indifference to Eleanor's presence and began doing whatever sparrows do in the early morning when no one is watching. I should have stayed that Thursday, she said. In August. I should have slept on the couch. The appointment wasn't. It wasn't important. I've been trying to remember what it even was and I can't. I can't remember what I chose over one more night with you, and I think that's the thing I'm going to carry for a while. Maybe a long while. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to pretend I made all the right choices," she said. "I know what I was. I know what I gave and what I didn't. Gerald wasn't wrong about me, not entirely. Daniel deserved more of me than he got in those years. I know that. I've known it for a long time. I think I thought that doing the work I was doing was enough. That it counted. That saving someone's son somewhere overseas was the same as being present for my own." The sparrow flew off. "It wasn't the same," she said. "I know that now. I think I knew it then. I just didn't know how to be both things at once, and I chose. I kept choosing the thing I was better at. And I'm not going to apologize for the work. I'm not. I can't. But I can say that I wish I'd figured out how to be better at the other part. Sooner. Before." She stopped. "Before you were gone." She didn't say it. It was in the air anyway. She sat there for a long time. Long enough for the light to shift, the early flat gray of 7 a.m. becoming the slightly warmer gray of 8, the cemetery coming into its daytime self, a groundskeeper appearing at the far end of the property with a wheelbarrow, a family arriving at a grave near the spruce trees and standing together in the particular quiet of people who have come to do exactly this. Eleanor watched the family without watching them. A woman her age, 2 adult children, a small grandchild who didn't understand what the visit was for and kept looking at the sparrows. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the birthday card in Kristen's handwriting and the way she had put it on the windowsill and told herself it didn't matter. She thought about the phone call where he'd said, "Grandma says you chose your career over Dad," and she had cut him off because she didn't want to hear what Dolores said. She thought about how long she had been protecting herself from information that might have required her to change something. She thought, he's 34. He has 2 children under 5. He is stretched thin and he married a woman who sends cards on time and knows the names of all the neighbors, and he probably chose her partly because she is everything I am not, and that is all right. That is allowed. Children are allowed to correct for their parents. She thought, I should call him. Not to explain. Not to ask for anything. Just to say, I see you. I see what you built. I'm sorry I wasn't there for more of the building. She would call him today. She would call him today, and she would not make it about herself. The thing about grief, Eleanor had observed across 30 years of medicine and war, was that it did not move in a line. She had seen this in field hospitals and in recovery wards and in the faces of families in waiting rooms who had just been told something that reorganized their world without their consent. Grief did not go from bad to better in a clean progression the way a wound healed. New tissue, then scar tissue, then the scar fading. It went sideways and backward and through rooms you thought you'd already cleared, and then one morning you found yourself sitting in a folding chair in a cemetery talking out loud to a piece of granite and understanding something you should have understood years ago, and that was progress, apparently. That was the work. She had been in the work for 10 days. She thought she would be in it for a long time. She was not afraid of that. She had done long work before. She knew how to show up for something day after day without knowing when it would resolve. That much, at least, 30 years had taught her. What she was less sure about, what she was sitting with in the folding chair in the morning light, was the question of what came after. Not after grief. After the specific shape her life had been until now. The apartment on Jefferson Street. The retirement that had not quite felt like retirement. The studio with the photograph on the windowsill, and the cup of coffee she always made too strong. Her mother's house on Elm Street was too large for one person. She had been thinking this for 2 weeks. Thinking it and setting it aside because it felt too practical for the moment, too much like moving forward when she wasn't sure she had finished being still. But sitting here, in this particular stillness, she thought, Ruth Ellen Carpenter tended this house for 40 years. She kept it as a place people could come back to. As a place that held the shape of a family, even when the family was scattered. She thought, Daniel's children have never seen the oak tree. She thought, there is a garden that needs someone. She did not make any decisions. She was not a woman who made decisions in cemeteries on Saturday mornings, or rather, she was not a woman who made decisions before she had thought them through from enough angles, and she had not yet thought this one through. But she noted the thought. She set it somewhere she could find it again. Before she left, she walked back through the veterans section. She stopped at her stone. She looked at it in the morning light that was now a little warmer, a little more itself. Served with distinction. She thought about those words differently than she had 10 days ago. 10 days ago, they had felt like a verdict, official, external, handed down by an institution that had processed her record and arrived at a conclusion. 3 words that said, "We have assessed you and found you adequate." Standing here now, having sat for an hour with her mother and her own history and the specific weight of what she had given and what she had withheld, she thought the words meant something more uncomfortable and more true. Distinction was not a grade. It was not a score on a test you either passed or failed. It was the accumulated weight of every room you had stayed in when leaving would have been easier. Every decision you had made in the dark with insufficient information. Every person you had helped carry something they couldn't carry alone. It was also, and this was the part she was still learning, the accumulated weight of every room you had walked out of too soon. Every appointment that wasn't worth it. Every Thursday when you could have slept on the couch and didn't. Distinction included the whole of it. The commendations and the absences. The surgeries and the missed graduations. The 30 years of service and the one moment in a Fairfax mediator's office when she had made herself small and called it integrity. She had served with distinction. She had also failed in ways that mattered. Both things were true and both things were hers, and she was, standing here in the morning light with her hands in her pockets and her knees aching and her mother 2 rows over under a simple stone that sat at rest. She was beginning to understand that carrying the full weight of both was not a punishment. It was just what it was to have lived. She stopped at the office on her way out. Paul Garrett was at his desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Colonel," he said, and then caught himself. "Sorry. I don't know your preference." "Eleanor," she said. He nodded. "Eleanor." "Coffee. I've had enough coffee to last the week," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you. For the position you chose. For taking off your hat." Paul Garrett looked at her for a moment with his weathered face and his white mustache. "My father served," he said. "Korea." He never talked about it much. But I knew what it cost him. A pause. "I always figured the least I could do was make sure the ones who served got placed right." Eleanor nodded. "He would have liked that," she said. "Your father?" Paul Garrett looked briefly at something on his desk. "I hope so," he said. She left him to his paperwork and walked through the iron gate and past the spruce trees to the parking lot and stood beside her car for a moment in the October air, which was cold now and clean and smelled like the very end of things and the very beginning of others. She got in the car. She drove to Elm Street. She parked in front of the house and sat for a moment looking at the oak tree, still holding a few leaves, yellow-brown, the last ones, and then she got out and went inside and called her son. He answered on the second ring. "Mom." "Daniel," she said. "I just want to talk. Not about anything in particular. I just want to hear how you are." A pause. She heard, in the background, the sound of small children, something falling, someone laughing, the ordinary noise of a household in morning motion. "Yeah," he said, and his voice did something she recognized as relief. "Yeah, okay. Let me just..." He said something to Kristen, muffled, and then he was back. "Okay. I'm here." "Good," Eleanor said. "Me too." Eleanor found the photograph on a Sunday. She had been working through her mother's house in sections, the kitchen done, the living room mostly done, the back bedroom still in progress because every box she opened required more time than she anticipated, and she had stopped fighting that. She had learned in 10 days of this work that her mother had kept everything. Not in the way of someone who couldn't let go, but in the way of someone who understood that objects carry information that words can't hold, that a birthday card from 1987 or a child's drawing or a program from a church concert tells you something about a life that no summary can. Ruth Ellen Carpenter had kept every letter Eleanor had ever sent her. Every one. They were in a shoebox in the back of the bedroom closet, wrapped in a rubber band that had dried and cracked and left a faint mark on the envelopes. Eleanor sat on the floor with the box in her lap and went through them slowly, one at a time. Korea, 1989. Germany, 1993. Iraq, 2003. Afghanistan, 2009. She read her own handwriting across 20 years of deployments, and she found, in the letters, a version of herself she had forgotten. Younger, more uncertain, more willing to say the thing directly because the distance made it safe. In the 2003 letter, written 2 months after Mosul, she had written, "I am okay, Mom. Don't worry about the news. I am okay in the ways that matter and working on the ways that don't, and that's the best I can tell you. Some nights I sit outside the tent and look at the sky and think about the oak tree. I don't know why the oak tree specifically. I think it's just the thing my brain goes to when it needs somewhere to be. She read that twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands for a moment. The way you hold something fragile, the way you hold something you didn't know you'd lost. The photograph was beneath the letters, at the bottom of the box. She almost missed it. It was face down, tucked under the last envelope. The kind of placement that looks accidental, but in her mother's orderly system was never accidental. She turned it over. It was from the wedding. 1992. The chapel on base. Eleanor in her dress uniform, Gerald in his good suit, both of them young in a way that was almost difficult to look at directly, not because they looked happy, though they did, but because they looked so entirely unaware of what was coming. The particular innocence of people who have made a large decision and not yet begun to live inside it. Ruth Ellen had kept this photograph. She had kept it at the bottom of the box, under the letters, face down, not thrown away, not on display. Kept. The way you keep things that belong to a part of your life that is over but was real. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. She thought about Gerald for the first time in a while, not as the person on the other side of the mediator's table, not as the man whose mother had filed paperwork at 8 a.m. on the morning of her mother's funeral, but as the man in the photograph. 31 years old, standing in a chapel on base in his good suit, looking at Eleanor like she was something he hadn't expected and was glad about. He had been glad. She believed that. Whatever had come after, whatever had been misaligned and costly and ultimately irreparable, he had been glad in that chapel. She had been glad too. She thought there were good years. Before the second deployment, before Daniel's adolescence, before the gaps became structural rather than circumstantial. There were years when they ate dinner at the same table 3 nights a week and took walks on Sunday mornings and argued about small things and made up and were, in the ordinary understated way of two people building a life, happy. She had not thought about those years in a long time. She had been so focused on what broke that she had let the thing that was before the breaking go dim. She set the photograph on the floor beside her and continued through the box. At the very bottom, she found one more thing. A note in her mother's handwriting, on a piece of paper torn from the small notepad Ruth Ellen kept by the kitchen phone. No date. No salutation. Just her mother's handwriting, round, careful, the handwriting of a woman who had learned cursive properly and never unlearned it. Eleanor, I kept this because I think you two were good together once, and I don't want you to forget that. Whatever else is true, that is also true. Don't let the hard end make you forget the good beginning. Mom. Eleanor sat on the floor of her mother's back bedroom for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it always came through in October. Low amber, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being remembered even while it's happening. The recipe box was on the bed. The letters were in the shoebox. The photograph was on the floor. She picked up the photograph. She looked at it one more time. Gerald in his good suit, herself in dress uniform, both of them young and unaware and glad. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She got up, went to the kitchen, found an envelope in the drawer by the phone, and wrote Gerald's address on it from memory. She put no letter inside. No explanation, no apology, no carefully composed statement of where she stood and what she understood now. She just put the photograph inside and sealed the envelope. She would mail it tomorrow. He would know what it meant or he wouldn't. Either way was all right. The envelope to Dolores took longer. She sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, 10 days after she'd found the photograph, 27 days after the burial, with a blank piece of paper and a pen and the understanding that she was going to write something she didn't have the words for yet. She had thought about calling. She had picked up the phone twice and set it down. Not because she was afraid of the conversation, but because she didn't trust herself to hold the right line in real time. She was better on paper, always had been. Better when she could look at the words before she sent them and make sure they were saying what she meant and not what she felt, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. She wrote, Dolores. She stopped. She crossed it out. Started again. I've been trying to decide whether to contact you. She stopped again. Crossed it out. She put the pen down and looked at the blank paper and thought about what she actually wanted to say. Not what she should say. Not what would be graceful or measured or above reproach. What she actually wanted. She wanted to say, "You hurt me." Clearly on purpose, at the worst possible moment, in the most calculated way you could find. "You hurt me." She wanted to say, "I never understood what I did to make you decide I wasn't worth basic decency." She wanted to say, "There were 32 years in which you could have chosen differently and you didn't, and I kept showing up to your table anyway, and I would like some acknowledgement of what that cost." She sat with all of that. Then she picked up the pen. She wrote, "I'm not writing to relitigate anything. I don't think that would help either of us. I found a photograph. I think you should have it." She put the pen down. Read it back. Read it again. That was it. That was the whole letter. 2 sentences. She folded it around the second photograph, the one from the drawer, Eleanor in dress uniform at the military function, Gerald slightly uncomfortable beside her, both of them in a world Dolores had spent 32 years refusing to enter. She sealed the envelope. She addressed it. She held it in both hands for a moment. She thought about what Gerald had said, "She's not been herself," and about the image of Dolores sitting alone in the living room with the photograph from the drawer in her lap. She thought about a woman who had spent her entire life being certain, and what it must feel like to arrive at 78, at the specific uncertainty of having been wrong in a way that can't be taken back. She felt, this surprised her, something close to sorrow. Not forgiveness. Not yet. That was a different place, and she wasn't there, and she was not going to rush herself to get there for the sake of arriving cleanly. But sorrow. Genuine sorrow for a woman who had chosen not to look, and now had to live with what she'd missed. That was enough for now. That was the beginning of something, even if she couldn't name it yet. Gerald called her on a Thursday. She was in the garden, her mother's garden, the one that needed someone. She had been out there for an hour pulling the last of the dead stalks, clearing the beds before the hard frost came, trying to understand what Ruth Ellen had planted and where and whether it would come back in the spring or whether it needed replanting. She was not a gardener. She had never been a gardener. But she was a woman who knew how to learn a thing that mattered, and this mattered, so she was learning it. Her phone was in her coat pocket. She almost didn't hear it over the sound of the wind in the oak tree. "Eleanor." Gerald's voice. She hadn't heard it in over 2 years. Not since a brief, uncomfortable phone call shortly after the divorce was finalized, when they had talked about Daniel's upcoming graduation in the careful way of 2 people who have decided to be civil and are working harder at it than they are letting on. "Gerald. I got the photograph," he said. "I thought you might." A pause. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, in the background, the particular silence of a house with no children in it, the quiet of a later life, settled and a little empty. "I'd forgotten how young we were," he said. "We were very young," she said. "Eleanor," he stopped. She waited. "I'm sorry. About my mother. About what she did." She pulled a dead dahlia stalk from the soil and set it aside. "You don't have to apologize for your mother," she said. "I know I don't have to. I want to." She considered that. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Another pause. Longer this time. "I told her," he said, "what you'd done. The recommendation. The house. All of it. I don't know why I never told her before. I think I assumed she knew somehow. That she'd observed it. But she chose not to look," Eleanor said. "People do that. It doesn't mean they can't stop. He paused again. "She's not well, Eleanor. Not the headstone, that didn't make her sick. She was all ready. It's her heart. She's been seeing a cardiologist since August. She didn't tell me until last week." Eleanor stopped pulling stalks. "How serious?" she said. The nurse in her, immediate and precise. "Manageable," he said. "For now. But she's 78. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She received your letter," he said. "She didn't tell me what was in it. She said she was going to write back. That she needed to think first." Eleanor looked at the garden around her. The cleared beds. The oak tree at the edge of the property, bare now, holding its shape against the sky. "Tell her to take her time," she said. "I will. And Gerald," she paused. "I'm glad you called. I mean that." She heard something in his breath. Not quite relief. Something older than relief. "Me too," he said. Dolores's letter arrived on a Monday. It was short. Eleanor had expected short. Dolores was not a woman who elaborated when precision would do, and whatever else was true about her, she had always been precise. It said, "Eleanor." I looked at the photograph for a long time. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to make adequately. I am going to try anyway, because Gerald tells me you deserve the attempt even if the execution falls short. I decided early that you were a certain kind of woman. I was wrong. I don't know if I would have seen it sooner if I'd tried harder, or if I needed to be brought to the end of something before I could see the beginning of what I'd missed. I suspect the latter. I suspect that is not a flattering thing to admit. The plot has been corrected. Your name is back where it belongs. I should not have done what I did. I did it in a moment I am not proud of, to cause pain I had no right to cause. I don't expect anything from you. I am not writing because I expect anything. I am writing because I was wrong and you should know that I know it. Dolores. P.S. Gerald says the garden at your mother's house needs work. He says you've been out there every morning. I don't know if it helps to know this, but Howard's mother had that same garden. She planted the dahlias in 1962. They come back every year if you leave the bulbs in deep enough. Eleanor read the letter twice. She sat at the kitchen table for a while, looking at the postscript. Howard's mother had planted the dahlias. They come back every year if you leave the bulbs in deep enough. She folded the letter. She set it on the table. Then she put on her coat and went out to the garden and dug her hands into the cold soil along the far bed, where the dahlia stalks had been, feeling carefully for the bulbs, the ones Ruth Ellen had tended for she didn't know how many years, the ones that had come from Howard's mother's hands before that, the ones that had been going into the ground and coming back up again since 1962 without anyone asking permission. She found the first one about 4 inches down, round and firm and cold in her hand. Alive in the way that things underground in winter are alive, quietly, without display, doing the work of surviving in the dark until the conditions changed. She held it in her palm for a moment. Then she put it back, gently, and covered it with soil, and moved to the next one. She did not forgive Dolores Marsh that Monday. She wanted to be honest about that. It would make a cleaner story. The letter arrives, something releases, the weight lifts, the long work is done. But that was not how it was. The weight was still there. The phone call in Section C, row 14 was still there. The 32 years of small cruelties were still there, and they did not dissolve because a woman in Alexandria had written 6 careful sentences on a piece of stationery. What happened that Monday was smaller and more real than forgiveness. What happened was that Eleanor Marsh, on her knees in her mother's garden in the cold October morning, began to understand that she was not going to carry the weight of Dolores Marsh's choices for the rest of her life. Not because she was letting Dolores off the hook. Because she was letting herself off the hook. She was 61 years old. She had 31 years of service behind her and a garden in front of her, and a son who answered on the second ring, and a stone at the entrance of the veterans section that said her name in granite that would outlast everyone involved in this story. She had spent enough years making herself small. She did not have to carry this too. She dug up the last of the dahlia bulbs, checked each one, replanted the ones that were worth saving. She worked until her hands were cold and her knees ached, and the light had moved from morning into midday, and the oak tree cast its shadow at a different angle across the lawn. Then she went inside, washed her hands, made coffee she knew she was making too strong, and sat at the kitchen table in the house that had always been home even when she was 3 time zones away from it. She picked up her phone. She texted Daniel. The dahlias in Grandma's garden were planted in 1962. Thought you should know. Bring the kids in the spring when they come up. She set the phone down. She drank the coffee. She was not yet at forgiveness. But she was at something, some quieter, more durable thing that didn't have a clean name but felt, in the way real things feel, like it might last. That was enough for today. Tomorrow she would go back to the garden. The bulbs were in deep enough. They would come back. I drive past Roanoke Memorial Gardens, sometimes on my way to the grocery store on Campbell Avenue. It's not the most direct route. I know a shorter way down Jefferson, left on Elm, straight through. But I take the longer way often enough that I've stopped pretending it's accidental. I take it because of the light. In the morning, from the road, you can see the veterans section from the car. Just a glimpse, the iron gate, the spruce trees, and at the corner where the path turns, if the light is right, a piece of white granite catching the sun before anything else in that cemetery does. I used to stop and look. I don't anymore. Not because it stopped meaning something, but because somewhere in the last few months it stopped being something I needed to see in order to remember what it meant. The stone is there whether I stop or not. My name is there whether I stop or not. 31 years of what I did and who I was, in field hospitals and briefing rooms and mediators' offices and folding chairs in Section C, that is there whether anyone drives past and reads it or not. I know what it says. I don't need to stop to be reminded. The dahlias came up in April. Daniel brought the kids down for a weekend in May, Kristen too, who turned out to be a woman who knows things about gardens and didn't make Eleanor feel foolish for not knowing them, which Eleanor appreciated more than she said. They ate dinner at the kitchen table with the window open the way Ruth Ellen always had it, and Eleanor made pot roast from the recipe box, carrots cut too thick, bread from the bakery on Elm Street, and her granddaughter, who was 3 and had very strong opinions about everything, announced that the dahlias in the garden were the most beautiful flowers in the whole entire world with the absolute conviction of someone who has not yet learned to hedge. Eleanor looked at the dahlias through the kitchen window. They are, she agreed. She did not tell the child about Howard's mother. She did not tell her about 1962 or about the garden passing from hand to hand across 60 years of women who tended it without knowing they were tending it for each other. She thought maybe she would tell her someday, when she was old enough for the story to land the way it was supposed to. When she could understand that some things come back not because of anything grand or exceptional, but simply because someone put them in deep enough and then got out of the way. For now the child was 3 and the dahlias were the most beautiful flowers in the whole entire world. That was enough. Here's the thing I've been trying to say since the beginning of this story, and keep approaching from different angles because I'm not sure I know how to say it directly. I spent a long time believing that the work was enough. That if I showed up where I was needed and did what I was trained to do and carried what I was given to carry, that was the whole of it. That was what a life was. Duty, service, competence. The rest would sort itself out. It doesn't sort itself out. The rest requires the same thing the work requires: showing up, being present, staying in the room when leaving would be easier. I was good at that in operating theaters. I was less good at it in kitchens. I know the difference now in a way I didn't know it at 40, or 50, or even 60. I know it now because I ran out of time to learn it gradually. That's not a complaint. That's just what it is to have lived in the way I lived. I am not sorry for the service. I will never be sorry for the service. But I carry the Thursday in August the way I carry Mosul, in the room I don't open for guests, in the part of myself I've learned to be honest about without letting it run the whole house. I served with distinction. I also failed in ways that mattered. Both things are mine. Both things are true. And I am standing here in my mother's kitchen with the window open and the dahlias in the garden and my granddaughter's voice in the next room. I am learning, finally, to hold both without needing one to cancel out the other. That's the whole of it. That's the thing I couldn't have told you at the beginning. If this story found you at the right moment, if you've spent years being measured against a standard someone else set, in someone else's dining room, by someone who chose not to look, I hope it reminded you of something. You don't need their permission to know your own worth. You never did. The granite doesn't lie. The work doesn't disappear because someone filed paperwork at 8 in the morning. 30 years of showing up doesn't vanish because a woman decided, at the worst possible moment, that she had the last word. She didn't have the last word. The last word is still being written, in gardens, and phone calls on second rings, and kitchens with windows open, and children who have very strong opinions about dahlias. If someone in your life needs to hear that tonight, share this with them. Not for me. For the Thursday you still have left.